Hey, do you want to learn how to make an Argent bass like this? Well, then you're in the right place. Keep watching. Right, so what I've started out with is a simple MIDI pattern that gets repeated 4 different times. Now, what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna go into my synthesizer and make a bass sine wave. You can see in the bottom right that it's around 70 Hz. Next, what I'm gonna do is introduce another sine wave. Then, I'm gonna introduce a saw wave. Next, I'm gonna use a plugin called OTT, and it's a completely free upwards compressor. Well, it's an upwards and a downwards compressor, but I'm mainly gonna use it for its upwards capabilities. And let's see, so I turn the time usually down to 0%, upwards to 200%, downwards to 0, and I lower the output gain. Next, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stop sending out sounds from this MIDI channel and I'm gonna send it to another bus. And this whole Argent bass you're gonna learn is more of a culmination of different sounds that interact with each other rather than one single synth patch. Right, so my next plugin of choice is called Isotope Trash 2. I think if you've seen any of Geoff Plays Guitars videos, he uses this quite a lot. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set it to multiband mode. I'm gonna change this a bit because I want to keep some of the bass intact, but I want to distort the middle of the sound. Right, so as you can see, that is peaking quite a bit, but that's alright because we got a limiter on the mix bus. If you've done any kind of formal education, this is probably not going to be to your liking because we're going to peak a lot, we're going to drive things a lot, and we're going to distort a lot of things beyond what you usually are used to. But what you need to understand also is that this bass needs a lot of movement in it, some of which can be automated. So what I'm doing is just automating different parameters, and I'm adding distortion just randomly, really. So what I'm doing is I'm just randomly picking distortion types to introduce some kind of movement to the sound. Right, now that I've automated a couple of parameters, mainly the mix amount and the drive amount, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna introduce another OTT. I'm gonna turn up the upwards, downwards down to 0, and I'm gonna lower the gain amount. What I'm also gonna do before I play this sound is I'm also gonna introduce another limiter. Usually I tend to do it at -3 in true peak so that it doesn't go above it. So we're gonna do another bus, and this one I'm gonna call movement. Simply because this is where a bulk of the movement that you hear within the sound is gonna happen. Not due to automation, but due to special effects such as chorus, flanger, or phases. So you can hear that it's very sort of bubbly or prickly sounding. Alright, with this, it is very loud, so let me bring a limiter. Right, so this isn't a very impressive sound so far, but this is very much like baking a cake, a very, very thick and one with a lot of layers. So, just because I've got 2 buses here doesn't mean that you need to have 2 buses as well. This is just to keep things simple and under the 10-minute mark, hopefully. So I've got a distortion, I've got movement. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go up to the mix bus, and guess what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna add another compressor. Right, that seems fine so far. What I'm gonna do next is I'm actually gonna introduce some proper compression this time, and I'm gonna try and retain the transients while doing about, let's see, about 6 decibels of compression. There's a lot of playing around with compression when it comes to these kind of sounds, because there's a lot of things happening at once. Right, so I'm gonna try and do the fastest release and try and nail this. Right, that seems alright so far, not too fussed about it. What we're gonna do next is introduce a distortion plugin that you don't typically see used for synthesizers, at least I don't. And that is a guitar distortion plugin. Now we're gonna leave it as stereo, even though it is a bass. I'm not gonna keep it mono. I wanna keep it wide. I'm gonna keep the oversampling on high. And what I'm gonna do is turn off the cabinet simulation. I'm gonna turn off reverb, turn off the equalizer, the overdrive compressor. I'm just gonna use the sort of amp head. I'm gonna try and scoop this as if I was making a guitar sound. Right, so what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna add some more saturation. So if you've got any kind of saturation plugins, now is the time to start layering them and then seeing what they do to it. Right, so what I have next is a series of EQs that are doing slightly different things to the sound. This is very dependent on how you want yours to sound like, or the mix that you want this to be a part of. And we're gonna do the same thing as we've done with the automation when it came to the distortion. We're gonna make an EQ, and we're gonna grab a couple of the bands and then move them around as the synthesizer's going. So let's see. Right, so I've done that now. As you should be able to see, the equalizer is constantly moving as the sound is being played. So that instantly makes it a bit more interesting. It sounds like you're doing more than what you're actually doing, but who cares if it sounds good. Right, so I've also have another plugin with some phaser and flanger on it. You can do this with individual plugins. This is just easier for me to show. Just has some more movement to it now. And I'm gonna do something called a pull tech trick. So I'm just boosting and attenuating via this fat channel XT equalizer at the same, if not similar frequencies. So that's doing some control on the low end. What I'm gonna do after that is I'm also gonna introduce another compressor, because there's a lot of things happening all at once. As you can see, this introduced some noise. That's why we've got the gate. So now we can dial that in. So if we're not doing anything, it's not playing any sound. And I'm gonna do the same thing, but I'm slowly gonna reintroduce the downward compression aspect of this OTT. Right, so what I've done now is I've also introduced another OTT doing the exact same thing, but I'm gonna turn up the time instead of 0 to about 30%. As you can see, there's now a lot of weird things happening on the high end. What you could do is you could go through each of these individual instances of plugins and then try and fine-tune things if you don't like the way that some of them sound, or if you want to try certain frequencies where something is happening that you don't like. Right, so now that that's done for the most part, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna introduce a kick, synthesized kick of course, that is gonna be playing the exact same thing. So let's see how that sounds like. A lot of this sound is really up to how you experiment and what you do it with. A lot of combinations of plugins that I have access to and I know of, you might not, and you might have your own that you can use in turn. The key is that you take your time, You try different things that you otherwise wouldn't, and you keep patience, because a lot of this can take a long time to sort of get your head around. Routing, like I said, sidechain compression, distortion and compression overall are key aspects that you really need to have a handle on to be able to successfully manipulate things according to how you want them to sound like. So now we've got a working Argent bass sound that, although you could fine tune, it's up to your liking and it's up to you. It's your decision of what else to do with it. But the key components are protecting your hearing, starting with a MIDI pattern or riff or bass line, then sending that to different buses. Don't be afraid to layer on a lot of compression, a lot of distortion, and really focus on automating a lot of aspects of your distortion plugins, of your equalizers, because that's where a lot of things that come into making this sound good lie.